Hi, thanks for that, Deepa, and thanks to Michal for inviting me down today. So I'm going to speak a bit about the restoration work we're doing in MPWS, and specifically the work we're doing on Lippy Head Bog, which is kind of between Dublin and Wicklow. And it's a pilot project, and I'll describe why we're describing it as a pilot project rather than a full-headed, classic project a little bit later on. And it's an example of kind of a public agency like ourselves and a private company like Intel working together for nature conservation. And I'll describe how that came about, why that partnership happened, what we've been doing, and what we hope to achieve in the near future. So just a little bit about me and MPWS. I'm sure you're all familiar with MPWS. What you may not be familiar with is that we're now a series of directorates after the revamp that we recently went through and are going through. We've been going through for a while yet. But I'm in the Scientific Advice and Research Directorate, so really what we do is kind of applied research. We advise on different nature conservation issues, different restoration issues, this type of thing. We try and guide management as best we can based on the science, best practice, our best knowledge here, internationally, etc., etc. Now there are other directorates. Conservation Measures is a new directorate. They're the directorate that will actually do the work. So what I'm describing today is a bit unusual that we've been doing the work, but really it's going to be them doing the work, with us kind of advising on how to do it. With licensing and regulation, international affairs, which has kind of been set up to deal with the nature restoration law, which was described earlier, wildlife enforcement, the national parks across the country, corporate affairs, that kind of thing. What we're really governed by is, as you all know, is the Habitats Directive, the Birds Directive, and upcoming the nature restoration law. So these three directives have had us very busy and are going to have us even more busy in the very near future. And as Shane rightly described earlier, the ambition is enormous with the nature restoration law. But I think it's very positive. But we're going to have to go through some teething problems, I think, for the next few years to kind of get that running. Our funding is state funded. We have a lot of funding from different EU projects, like Just Transition, Horizon, Interreg, and others. Okay, so I don't need to describe this to anyone in this room, just the peatlands map of Ireland. You mainly deal with the three broad types of peatlands, the raised bogs and the lowlands, the blanket bogs, highlands, and the fens. The SAC network, Special Area Conservation and Habitats Directive, I'm not sure exactly what it is, it's 15% or so of that peatland. So there's a lot of peatlands that's not protected or by MPWS, and I think that's where communities really need to come in and look at how to manage those type of areas that aren't designated as SAC or NHA, and probably never will be because there's so much of it. So that's where I think people need to kind of get together and that kind of thing. So there's obviously a lot of interest, and it was described earlier, about the carbon trading and credits and all that kind of stuff with peatlands. So as you know, peatlands is peat. It's been accumulating carbon for thousands of years at quite a slow rate. And when it's a sink, the carbon takes in about 50 grams of carbon in the CO2 per hectare, per metre squared, I should say, per year, which is quite small, but it's persistent, and it's persisted over a long time. But it needs to be wet. The peatland needs to be wet to carry out this function. And the interesting thing about this is that this kind of number has been measured from a few different studies in Ireland, myself and others, but also everywhere else in the world. Canada, Siberia, UK, everywhere. It's around 50, give or take, depending on how wet or hot particular years. That's because the plankton is small. It can only grow so high. It's not a tree. It doesn't have roots, so it can only take in so much. Now, the real problem with peatlands is when you drain it. And when you drain it, you emit carbon because it's basically carbon soil. So it oxidizes and releases that stored carbon back to the atmosphere. And again, the numbers are pretty consistent between 100 to 300 grams of carbon in CO2 per metre squared per year. It gets a little bit higher on the continent where it's a bit hotter, but here it's around that. And what's interesting about this photo is actually the same patch of bog. This is flower bog taken during an ecotope survey by my colleague Fernando Fernandez And then when we resurveyed the same patch of bog a few years later, it had turned to this, dominated by Cluna and bear peat and all this type of stuff. So this part of the bog was drained. So it's easy to drain a bog, as we all know. It's very hard to wet it again to be like this sphagnum, because it kind of establishes itself to these kind of sensitive conditions, and then when you get rid of that, it's tougher getting back there. So that kind of leads me to this, what kind of state are the peatlands in? Again, we all know this, a lot of different pressures over a long, long time on peatlands, peat mining, drainage for turbary, land use conversion for agriculture and forestry, all this type of stuff. So it's all led us to be in a pretty poor nick, and it's been in a poor nick for a long time, as we report to the Habitats Directive. And from a CO2 perspective, we think it probably emits maybe 6 to 10 million tonnes of CO2 per year. We don't have an exact figure on that, but there's a lot of mapping projects going on at the moment, quite sophisticated mapping projects. So I think this will refine that in the coming years. So there's a lot of work to do in restoration. MPWS has a kind of a big restoration program ongoing for the last number of years, mainly on the raised bogs. A lot of our SACs have been addressed and are being addressed, and we hope to have them all kind of restored as best as we can. Some of them can't be restored, but in the next 5 to 10 years, something like that. A good example of a restoration project is right out here. It's one of the best avenues bog. Not an MPWS project, that was all community led by Chris Hughes. And I would always say this is a force of nature. And the results have been remarkable, I think. So, what I like about this project is that there's a lot of science done concurrently with the restoration work. And because that was done, we can look back in time and see how it's improved. And that's the real value for me for this project. So there was ecotope mapping done in the past, a lot of restoration work done, and then we see how the ecotope ecotopes have changed, and we see it's getting wetter in places, and the wet areas lag what we call central ecotopes increasing, and that has a good impact then on the local climate and sequestration and all that type of stuff. So that's really positive, and it shows you what can be done where you have a bog with a bit of peat left, with a bit of vegetation left, and relatively flat. That's really important, because when it's not flat, it's hard to restore in lowlands. Another example near Tyrrell's Pass, Cloncrow, which Terry's been dealing with. There have been funds put in here quite recently, and the recovery has been quite remarkable. It's gotten wet. You've got some sphagnum coming in already. We need to do some measurements on that, but that's very positive. It shows you how quick it can be if you've got the right conditions in place. Where it's trickier in the lowlands is where you cut away the vegetation and you're left with this kind of black landscape. That's much more difficult to deal with, because the hydrology is completely changed. You often don't have a lot of peat left, so the chemistry's changed a bit as well, and you've no vegetation, and that's quite problematic. Because you need vegetation for wind resistance, to kind of have this kind of natural insulation layer for anything that wants to come in if it's wet, like the sphagnum, tropic fuel, all that type of stuff. So we've done our own work here at a place called All Saints. It was a horticultural site back in the 90s. We put a flux tower, a lead furnace tower, to measure the CO2 and the methane before and after the restoration. Now this has just been completed, actually, the restoration work by Bord Mona, working with MPWS and that. And what we find is that the CO2 emissions have actually increased with the work. So we were finding the emissions was around 10 tonnes of CO2 per hectare per year. That's increased to about 20 with the restoration. And the reason for that, I think, is that we have a lot of cells with a lot of water, a lot of organic matter breaking down, a lot of degassing, all this type of stuff. That will come down. That will come down over the next few years. It'll only start to really come down once the vegetation comes in, and that may be years, decades. We don't really know how long that's going to take, but it will come down. It strikes home the point that, with climate change coming, and it is getting hotter, and all this kind of thing, you really can't wait to do this work. This work has to be done now, because this situation will just get worse the longer you leave it. But hence, and Ger spoke earlier about the Bord Mona scheme, and they're addressing a lot of that on their 33,000 hectares, similar type of stuff. So that's the kind of the lowlands. We have a very good handle on how to work in the lowlands, what to do and what to expect, all that type of stuff. The uplands is a bit different. There hasn't been a whole lot of work done on blanket bogs. The reason being, they're tricky. They're in the uplands. They're often on gradients. There's a lot of pressures that we don't really have on the lowlands, like overgrazing, erosion, gullying, all that type of stuff. So it's a harder beast to tackle in many ways. And we also have, issues with land ownership, a lot of commonage, all this type of stuff. So there's a lot of people who kind of work and own this type of land. So it's not easy to go and start doing restoration. And restoration of a blanket bog is a little bit different to a blanket bog anyway. And I'll look at that in a moment. So anyway, to kind of get the ball started on that, we started work on a place called Liffey Head Bog. If any of you are over around Sally Gap, it's between Sally Gap and Capure. So it's a military road, either side of that, that's Liffey Head Bog. And it's also the source of the River Liffey. And so it's an important headwater for the Liffey, and Liffey is an important water source for Dublin and Kildare. A lot of that water is kind of directed to some water treatment plants like Ballymore Eustace and other areas of Pleasant. So it's an important site. Now where Intel come in is Intel are obviously an enormous multi-corporation, and they have a company goal where they want to restore water in the environment. And they want to restore water in the environment because they use a lot of water in their manufacturing, in their server cooling, all this type of stuff. And they have a huge plant in Leitrim. And in fact, they're also about to complete another enormous plant in Leitrim. And they use a huge amount of water. So they wanted to invest in a nature type of restoration project. They've done a lot of type of work like this in the US, but they haven't done any work in Ireland. And then they got talking to us, and they wanted to do something. And then I said, well, look, all your water actually comes from up here. A lot of that blanket bog is not in great nick, and this is a no-brainer to do something like that. So we partnered up a little bit with that with a co-fund. The state is still paying the majority of this, by the way, but that's where the project came from. So we identified an area which I'll look at in a moment, but because we hadn't done a lot on blanket bog, we really went to town on the designs on this. A lot of hydrometry was put in, piezometers for water level, flumes and weirs for runoff, and I'll try why that was particularly important later on. We put in lots of collars for greenhouse gas measurement, doing water quality measurements, ecology of course, and on all that type of stuff. So this is the area here. As you see, it's kind of next door to the Liffey, and you can see where the water is going in Manor Kilbride. And they spend a lot of water. They spend a lot of money treating the water because it has a lot of carbon in it. Carbon is a natural, part of water that flows over an organic substance like peat. But if the peat is drained, the properties of that carbon change, and the loads will change as well, particularly at different times of the year. And this just to give you an idea of what it looks like. So you can see here there's a lot of drains either side of the road. Some of them are turned into gullies. The drains, we're not sure exactly why they were put in, probably to do with turf cutting back maybe after the Second World War. Just stories of people cutting there after the Second World War on the side of the road. Anyway, that's left its mark, and there's and they're still there. And a lot of the peatland's quite dry, so it was a good kind of case study to kind of get our teeth into. Now, even though it was drains, and normally blocking a drain is, it's pretty simple, we knew it wouldn't be simple on a blanket bog, mainly because it's on a slope. And you've all seen landslides in Ireland over the past number of years. Peat has the chemical, physical consistency of paint. It doesn't take a lot to move it on a slope. So if you go onto a peatland with a machine and start to block drains and storing all that water, you're just introducing a force, and that force will just push it if there's a slip face and if there's a slope. So before we did anything, we did a lot of geophysics and geotechnical work done by a guy called Andy Trafford. And what he did, he did GPR surveys in areas that we identified as being kind of having potential for restoration. And basically what he did is he matched the peak depth. The peak depths were a bit deeper than I was expecting, up to 5 meters in places. And he also looked at the angle of the peaks in a mineral interface. So when we're looking at the top of the land and it has a slope, when we look beneath this, the peat, and the peat slope on the bedrock and the mineral soil was actually steeper than the land. And what he also did is he looked at the water content of the peat. Normally peat that's drained, the water content will be a bit lower than in undisturbed conditions, but he was finding that the water content was actually very high in the peat. So these factors combined basically mean there's a lot of area here you can't go in with machine. You have to go in with your hands, basically. So a lot of this has to be done by hand, or is being done by hand. Now what that means from a financial perspective is that the cost almost doubled. So I thought this project would cost maybe 300 to 400 grand. It's going to be closer to $1 million, because of all these complications. So bank bogs are tricky in many respects. So this is the site here where we have kind of the areas marked, and the red lines are where we marked exclusion zones. So these are the areas you have to go in by hand. Everything else can be done by machine. Just to give you an example of the hydrometry that we're doing, this is kind of the typical behaviour of the flow in a blanket bog. It basically, when it rains, the water just goes up, and when it stops raining, it goes right back down. P-plan should hold that water and should come down gradually. So we've measured this for a couple of years before the works. We'll measure this after the works to see what impact it has on the hydrology. On the quality here, we've been working with UCD on the water quality. Nutrients is quite low. What's interesting is that the pH is really low. Here is about 3, in areas it's about 2, and on Law Pro we're integrating with Law Pro on this too. So that's obviously a health concern. I think it's the peat drainage interacting with the hard rock and the mineralogy there. And we're also looking at the DOC and the eptom, so it's very high when we get a flood, the DOC and the eptom. So hopefully we do it after when we'll see how that goes. So I'll try and wrap it up now. This last couple of slides. So just to summarise, we're looking at 60 hectares. We've divided the project into 2 phases, phase 1 and phase 2, mainly because we need to figure out how to do this work in phase 1, and we've been doing that with actually Board Mona, who are working with us as the contractors. We're looking at different methods, techniques, all this type of stuff, and we want to develop a best practice manual. So we're just about to finish phase 1, and here's just an example of what it looks like. Here are some of the peat dams we put in with machine. We purposely didn't put them too high, because that's the side of the road. We put them a little bit lower than normal. I know it'll shrink a bit, but it's already re-wetting really quickly. Here's an example of the plastic dams. This is all done by hand, and this is to show you the live land over here. So the next steps, so we're currently finishing up in phase 1. We're designing phase 2 just to address the rest of that. We want to expand into other areas of the Wicklow Mountains National Park, probably working with Shane, PFI and all this type of thing, and apply our learnings and methods to other upland areas. The east is a bit trickier than the west because it's drier, and to continue our scientific monitoring and try and understand the results and develop best practice guidance. Okay, thank you.